Alison, thanks so much for coming on. Been trying to talk to you for a few days in relation to this.
No.
And actually today is a good day to talk about this because we have confirmation that the trial of the Army veteran known as Soldier F is beginning. It will get underway on Monday in Belfast.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a very short preliminary hearing this morning, and there was some discussion that there could be a further delay in this case due to the fact that the defence, the military of defence have provided defence lawyers to Soldier F. They have applied for further disclosure, but that was easily sorted out this morning. There's also, I believe, going to be a change of judge in terms of that case, but it is going to go ahead, and it has been beset with delays. This case, as you know, and so for the families, most of whom are quite elderly now.
Yeah.
And then with the survivors, any further delays, I think they would have been quite traumatic given how many stops and starts we've had in this case already. So as is now all things, it'll start Monday morning.
Yeah. So are you expecting that to look like on Monday?
Well, what you would get is quite a significant number of politicians who would attend it. Colm Eastwood has attended all those earlier hearings. The families themselves have travelled en masse back and forward during those hearings as well. And then you also have an absolute sea of legal professionals, junior barristers, senior barristers, in relation to that case as well. So, a large legal contingent, a large media contingent as well, because remember, there is significant interest in these cases involving former soldiers, not just locally, but in terms of the English, particularly, I suppose, what we consider the sort of more conservative right-wing leaning newspapers in England, the Express, the Daily Mail, people like that. They have shown a real interest in any of these prosecutions of soldiers who served in Northern Ireland. So I would expect you'd get quite a few journalists here for that hearing, as well as obviously the local reporters and the court reporters and the people who cover those cases day in, day out.
Yeah, it just feels so significant. Now, he's charged with murder in relation to the killings of James Ray and William McKinney, and he's also pleaded not guilty. So he's pleaded not guilty to that, and he's pleaded not guilty to 5 counts of attempting to murder Patrick O'Donnell, Joseph Reel, Joe Mahon, Michael Quinn, and somebody known as an unknown person on the same date, which was the day of the bloody Sunday massacre. Who is Soldier F and what can we say about him? He's been given anonymity by the courts.
Yeah.
We can't identify who he is, but do we know much about his background?
Well, no, we do know. I mean, this all obviously relates back for anyone who's younger maybe and doesn't know to a civil rights march that took place in the Bogside area of Derry on the 30th of January 1972, 2 lifetimes ago for some young people now. There was about 15,000 people attended that march. It was a peaceful march. 5 months earlier, the then British government had introduced, in the August of 1971, had introduced internment without trial. And as a result of that, hundreds of mainly men and boys were swooped up in the early hours of the morning by the British government and interned in the Long Cash internment camp without any trial or hearing. A lot of that, as we now know, was based on flawed and outdated intelligence. So a lot of people ended up behind bars who shouldn't have been. And it really is cited with radicalising a lot of people. Internment, as they say, was the biggest recruitment sergeant for the IRA that existed because it was considered so unjust. And at the start, it was only nationalists being interned. In the later years, they did intern some loyalists, and state papers have shown that a lot of that was to do with image and trying to show that the British government were being even-handed. So on that day, at this stage, they'd also passed laws outlawing demonstrations and all sorts of other issues were going on. We had a very unionist government still sitting at Stormont, completely unionist dominated, who were determined to quash any sort of civil rights unrest through any means possible. And in this case, it meant bringing in the army to deal with what were civilian and peaceful protests. It's always an issue when you have what we had, which was our conflict here, which isn't a war in terms of, 2 warring armies fighting each other. At that stage, it was a very, armies, a lot of soldiers who had served in other places with the British Army, who then were coming into very urban, built-up housing estates. The parachute regiment went in and opened up. There was quite a few soldiers who were named, albeit using the ciphers, during the Savile inquiry, the Bloody Sunday inquiry, in relation to the murders of people who took place on that day. And it was accepted, obviously, at the end of that inquiry, when that inquiry ruled that they had all been unlawfully killed. And then we had that really famous apology by David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, in the House of Commons the day that ruling was published. So Soldier F was just one of those soldiers. He was a member of the Parachute Regiment. He'd been quite a young man at that stage. And he was one of the people who was considered to be one of the main shooters on that day and responsible, as you said, for it's been alleged that he was responsible directly for the murders of 2 people and for the attempted murders of 5 others. Other soldiers who served then, some of them have since deceased. And then there was a very lengthy process after the Bloody Sunday inquiry published its findings, where there was a prosecution investigation. We didn't know whether anyone was going to be charged in relation to that, never mind whether or not it was going to be, there could have been at one stage, it was suggested that maybe 3 soldiers would be charged. At one stage, it was suggested maybe 1 would be charged. And in the end, Soldier F was charged. There was a challenge to that. So this is why I'm saying this has been a very, very long, ongoing process. So the lawyers representing Soldier F argued that this was completely insufficient, the evidence in this case. They tried to stop the prosecution. That was at one stage successful. The families, the Bloody Sunday families, through their lawyers, the majority of them are represented by Madden Finucane solicitors who have been with this case the entire way through. They then challenged that. That was then successful, and the judge ruled that that it was unlawful for them not to stand trial. There's something like 125,000 pages of evidence. So in March 2019, so this is how long again this to and fro from the courts has been on, the prosecutor said that they would be sending Soldier F to trial. Again, as I said, in 2021, prosecutors then dropped the case. And that was after the collapse of a trial of 2 other soldiers who were accused of a completely separate Troubles era killing. And at that stage, they said relying on evidence that had been taken from other soldiers at that time, which I think was by the Royal Military Police, was not admissible. So the Bloody Sunday families challenged that. They said that this was a damning indictment of the British justice system, and their legal challenge against that was successful. So the court then rejected an attempt by the PPS to have its own appeal referred to the Supreme Court. And so in September 22, the PPS had to say then that they were going to resume the prosecution of Soldier F. She was returning for trial in December 2023. They released a lot of dates here. And then last December, those charges were put to him and he pleaded not guilty. And that was the first time that Soldier F had actually appeared in person in court. All of these hearings were happening without him being there. In this occasion he was, but there is a curtain that is pulled across so that he can't be seen and identified. His lawyers have successfully argued that his life would be at risk. Now, albeit in the darkest depths of the internet, people have published his name, and some people have then been referred for prosecution for breaching that injunction and publishing his name. But, these things are very hard to keep hidden in an internet age. And so, as you said,
I was having a discussion down here just briefly about it, and there was a publication called The Village who actually named him down here because I'm not sure that we have to, and I'm not saying I'm not going to abide by the laws in a court that I hope to attend, but I don't think it's grey whether or not we have to be out, while out of the jurisdiction, whether or not we could identify. I wouldn't like to maybe try, but
I wouldn't want to test it, but I can see how there'd be an argument that how could it be prejudicial for him to be named as that junction going to stand there. There's no jury in this case, by the way, as we know. These cases take place in the diplomat courts that take place in front of a judge only. So you can't prejudice the jury, but he has been granted anonymity, and we do see anonymity orders granted, but not all those soldier cases. If you think about it, there was a case of Dennis Cunningham, who was a soldier who was charged with the attempted murder of a man who had the mental age of a 9-year-old. He actually died of COVID during the trial, but he was named. He had attempted to get anonymity and that was unsuccessful. So sometimes the judges will grant them and sometimes they won't. I would expect that at the end of this process that you could maybe get a challenge to the anonymity order, depending on the outcome. Clearly, if the prosecution isn't successful, there would be nobody that would even attempt to try an anonymity order to have it lifted. But if there was a successful prosecution, there might be a chance then that there would be another court case to say that it is no longer in the interest of justice to keep his name hidden. All of this is all just speculation at this stage because it hasn't happened.
Those bloody Sunday families and indeed their lawyers in Madden and Finucane have been decades fighting this all the way, have never forgot their relatives who were murdered in cold blood on the streets of Derry that day, and have an incredible energy and belief that justice must be served so long after. I mean, a lot of the relatives who will more than likely attend the court and etc. will be well in their 70s.
Yeah, and a lot of people would have given up by now. And some of the families did after the ruling, the Bloody Sunday inquiry, did say, well, look, we've been vindicated now and we're happy enough with that. Others said, well, no, it's clearly shown that these were unlawful killings, and if there's justice in the world, they should be prosecuted. And should the state forces who are there to uphold the law, should they not be held to the highest of standards if it comes to allegations that they've broke the law? We do know that all of this is controversial politically, because we had a Boris Johnson Conservative government, and during his bid to become leader of the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson made pledges to backbench MPs, some of whom had served in the army themselves, albeit they were much younger men, a lot of whom occupy constituencies in which there are army bases and a lot of military families, and they had pledged that they would bring an end to these prosecutions in Northern Ireland for anything that was Troubles related. They argue that these were very young men who were sent here at a time, and why should they be prosecuted if there's no prosecutions of paramilitaries and all sorts of other things. Boris Johnson made a pledge that he would stop that. He had it included in the Queen's speech and all sorts of other things. And then he introduced the Troubles and Legacy Act, which in effect gave an amnesty. What he found out very quickly when they consulted the Crown lawyers is you couldn't just give an amnesty to soldiers. They had tried to include Northern Ireland at one stage. The debate included in the Overseas Bill, which does give an amnesty of sorts to soldiers who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that it puts a statute of limitations on prosecutions. He couldn't do that. And the reason why they couldn't include Northern Ireland there is because you can't be at war with your own region, your own jurisdiction. Northern Ireland was under the rule of the British government. They couldn't, in fact, say that this was a war zone when who were they at war with? Their own citizens.
Yeah.
And so therefore that was a non-goer. Then they come up with all sorts. My goodness, we've been through so many leaks have come out of all sorts of, inventive and weird ways that they were going to come up with to stop these prosecutions. They were going to stop legal aid, which would have put an end to a lot of it. You'd have had to self-fund them. They were going to try and put a statute of limitations. And what they discovered was you can't give an amnesty to one section that was involved in the conflict here. It would never stand up legally in court, but they did come up with the ideas, well, okay, we'll just give everybody an amnesty. Soldiers, police officers, loyalist paramilitaries, Republican paramilitary, everybody gets an amnesty. And that, how it was, I suppose, portrayed maybe in some of the English press, which was, this is saving our boys and our veterans from prosecution. But, we have thousands of unsolved murders here. I think around 2,600 unsolved murders. Can you imagine if that was, somewhere in England saying, well, we're just not going to prosecute anyone. We're going to give everybody an amnesty because, it suits a political agenda. It was challenged and there was various different court cases. We do now have the ICRIR, which is meant to deal with some of those legacy cases. A lot of the nationalist families aren't cooperating with it and said it's not sufficient. But this, I would say, these prosecutions that we're seeing now in terms of Soldier F, we're coming to an end. We are coming to an end of this type of criminal prosecution for a number of reasons. First of all, politically, there's no British government wants to be seen to be prosecuting soldiers who served here. That's a completely different, and it's only a testament to the families that continue and don't give up despite, as you said, some of them being well in their 70s now, to keep this going. And the fact that they had lawyers who, at start, by the way, there was zero money in this. When they first took on this case and started pushing for the inquiry, there was no legal aid in this. There was no money. Those lawyers, and at that stage, Peter Madden, who owned Madden Finucane, was acting completely. There was, pro bono for those families and pushing that. There was nobody was getting paid a payday for that. And the story of how that came about is, the stuff of a Netflix documentary. It's like, Making a Murderer. It's just they piece by piece had to put together. They had to build models of the flats and where these killings took place. They had to get someone who had one of the old army issue rifles to show what direction it would have fired in, the velocity of it. They had to track people who lived in and around, attended the 15,000 people who attended that march, some of whom had immigrated to Australia and Canada and America, track them down, get witness statements off them. I mean, it was an effort, a complete effort.
Some of the press photography that was done on the day was very useful as well, because
a lot of it which was never published. So remember, like, if you, and we'd be out with photographers, they might take 40, 50 pictures and you use one. So they had to track down, do those photographers still have the negatives of the unused pictures that were never used, and what use would they be in evidence? And they then became part of the evidence bundle. So all of this was something that was only done through, I suppose, the sort of tenacity of the people involved. But I would say, we're coming near the end of the criminal prosecutions. There's a number of reasons. As I said, first one, politically, it's a hot potato. There's no votes for a single British Prime Minister in Northern Ireland. We don't get the vote for who's the Prime Minister. There's no votes for a single English MP in Northern Ireland. They would rather this was a headache that went away, and they tried to resolve without it having to go through the courts. There's also the age of the people involved, and you get to the point where not just suspects but witnesses are just either dead, or in many cases it's been argued that they're unfit to stand trial, that they have dementia, that memories fade. The method in which statements were taken at that time, a lot of these statements were taken in a way that they're saying wouldn't meet modern evidential standards, and therefore they're not admissible. Evidence wasn't stored the way it should be stored properly, so it was contaminated. We have had, there was evidence at one stage, and a lot of these troubles killings we were told was dumped because there was asbestos in a building and it all had to be dumped with it. There was a bomb at one stage, an IRA bomb, which blew up the forensic science lab many years ago, and they were saying some evidence disappeared there. So there's all sorts of reasons why I don't believe that there's going to be very many more, and that I do believe, the ICRIR being the main one, that the British government are saying prosecutions are coming to an end. You will get an investigation by the ICRIR. If they identify criminal liability and the fact that there's someone who could be charged, well, then that'll be passed on to the police. But apart from that, because the amnesty was part of this, was ruled to be unlawful and not in line with Article 2 compliant investigations. But we are coming near an end of these. And, that's, I suppose, another reason why it makes it significant. And, you see very elderly people going in and out of court in an over 50-year battle for justice. And a lot of this wasn't just to do with, getting the person who killed their loved ones convicted at the very beginning. A lot of this was to do with the fact that their loved ones' names had been blackened. They were civil rights marchers, but they were accused of being gunmen. They were accused of having nail bombs. They were accused of all sorts of things. And at the beginning, it was really a fight to clear their names and show that they had literally just been peaceful protesters who were shot dead.
And interestingly, anybody who is as an interest in exactly what happened on Bloody Sunday, and there's a fantastic museum there, and there's exhibits, and there's the whole story of it is told in that museum, which is right in the heart of where it actually happened,
There's bullet holes in the wall of the museum still from that time, and you can see the clothing that some of the victims were wearing, and it struck me just how small everything was. And I suppose people were tinier then, but everything was just so small. It's beautifully done. It's very simply done. It is, and a lot of you will meet some of the victims' families in that museum who also work there and volunteer there, and will show people around. And the Bloody Sunday Trust itself do work every year. They have, annual lectures and things like that to try and keep that alive. So the people of Derry, everybody who lives in Derry, no matter whether they're a young person or an old person, will know someone who was either killed or injured or was on that march, because Derry is a small place. It is a city, but it's a very small city. And it's somewhere where everybody associated will have some association with what happened on Bloody Sunday. And that's why, just this week, and leaving this case aside, the whole situation came back into the news because there was a recruitment fair that was taking place, and the British Army had been invited to that, and they were saying, well, no, you're not welcome. You're not coming to recruit the British Army in Derry, of all places, where the British Army caused so much destruction and grief. And that became a big political football in terms of we have the DUP and Sinn Féin fighting over that. So you can see, even the 50 odd years on, every now and then this comes around and becomes politically relevant again.
And I suppose finally, and this is, as we say, it's going to open on Monday, but is there, and I'll let you guide me on how we talk about this because of the anonymity he has been granted, but is there intrigue around Soldier F, around his personal life, how he is going to arrive in the north, where he'll stay? He's obviously told a court he's in fear for his life. Is there a threat to his life, and has he got supporters as well?
So in previous cases, such as the case where we have seen other British soldiers be prosecuted, they arrived. In some cases, we see the arriving with Johnny Mercer, the Tory MP, who had been a former soldier and served in Afghanistan, and there was pictures of them on the plane together, and, we're coming here to support them. You had Carla Lockhart, the DUP MP, saying, I stand with Dennis, and all sorts of there was supporters standing outside the court. I remember because they were listening, they were outside the court with, British Army memorabilia, those Help the Heroes t-shirts and all sorts of other things, but they were clearly listening to the court case on the site link through their phones while standing outside, but had not muted their cameras or microphones, and this was causing real disruption in the court, and they weren't listening, so they couldn't actually hear the court clerk saying, "Could you please mute that?" And then at one stage, one of the people started bitching about some of the other people in the campaign group, and I could hear them talking, and I'm like, they're not like this united group. They were having a right go with some other woman who'd been hanging around with them. I don't know. Anyway, so it all became a bit much. We're having a crackdown at the minute on the site link. The court service are changing the way it carries on. It is because there's so many times that people will come on and they purposely mess around on it, or just because they have no knowledge of how it works. So yeah, there'll be a difference in this case. He will have to be held somewhere securely, and you imagine that the MOD will arrange for that, he'll be put up somewhere that they can protect him. He will be brought in now through the back of the court rather than walking through the front as other defendants usually do. You won't see him at all. He'll be held in rooms in the court. He'll be brought out, and then, as I said, there will always be a curtain that will be covering him. When he is being cross-examined, there would be no jury, so the jury, no members of the public will see him at all. And usually in cases where someone has been a witness or defendant's been granted anonymity, they pull the curtain across, but in such a way that the jury can see them, so the jury can see their facial expressions and things, which are important when you're trying to establish a person's truthfulness. But there is no jury in this case, so only the judge will be able to see him. And so that's why I suppose it's different than what previous cases that we've had. And then you'll have a very large contingent of the families, I would assume, in the public gallery. You will have their lawyers and supporters and members of various different campaign groups that support him. And then you will obviously, I'm assuming, having people who will be there in support of Soldier F as well. So a lot of media and a lot of people in wigs as well.
His senior counsel, or you call it King's Counsel, I think, in the north, is it? It's Mark Mulholland, the same Mark Mulholland that showed up in the appeals court for Conor McGregor in that very bizarre case where the evidence was taken away, and then we've had an arrest this week of the two people who were supposed to be giving the evidence. So he's a fairly well-known barrister. He will be there to protect his client in every way. Will he? What do you think? Is there any chance he'll give evidence? Of course, it's up to the defendant whether they do give evidence in a case, but
they're often advised not to, but in his case, he may well decide to give evidence. Usually we get a situation where they're advised not to do that, but in these sort of cases, I think that what the prosecution, what the defence will probably try and do is paint him in some sort of sympathetic light as this, elderly man, and maybe in that way, because the public can't see him, they might think it might be beneficial for him to give evidence. But we'll see, and the thing about the barrister, as you said, so Mark Mulholland shows up in Conor McGregor and shows up in Soldier F. When someone is at the top of their game in terms of the legal profession, you see them popping up in all sorts of cases, all sorts of people and everybody. And I say this, everyone's entitled to a defence, and everyone, in the eyes of the law, if you want a fair trial, is entitled to a good defence. So we don't associate the solicitor or the barrister with the person. And just this week, we have been told that Conor McGregor has now changed legal counsel, as has James Lawrence, to Kieran Mulholland of Mulholland Law, who comes from West Belfast, from my neck of the woods. He went to St Mary's School in the Glen Road, went to University of Ulster, went to Queen's, and then moved down south. He can practice on both sides of the border. the last case that I was reporting on, Kieran Mulholland, was a guy who was an alleged dissident involved in Operation Arbacia, who was being extradited across the border. So he has changed to him, and Mulholland Law have put out a statement saying that they will now be countersuing Nicky DeHaan for James Lawrence in relation to what they claim as a vexatious application. So this is far from over. Conor McGregor seems to have very deep pockets when it comes to paying legal professionals. And at one point, if he keeps on going, he'll have went through every legal firm in the whole of Ireland.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, look, we'll leave it at that for the moment, and we will be coming back next week with hopefully what will be a very interesting opening in the trial of Soldier F for those murders in Derry. So thank you very much, Alison.
No problem.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.